Good afternoon. Dear students, alumni and guests, my name is Professor Grażyna Rębielak, and on behalf of Warsaw University of Technology Business School, I would like to welcome you very warmly to today's inspirational lecture. I want to welcome students and alumni of our university, Warsaw University of Technology, and in particular, our business school, our partners, our guests from Goa Management Institute from India, the University of Salford in Manchester, Sheffield Hallam University, Polimi Graduate School of Management, Politecnico di Milano, Baltic Management Institute in Vilnius and in Brussels, HEC in Paris, the Management Center in Innsbruck, and the Zicklin School of Business, Baruch College, New York City University. Today, the inspirational lecture will be delivered by Dr. Yukti Sharma, who is representing our partner Goa Institute of Management in India. Dr. Sharma is an associate professor in marketing. Her teaching interests center around consumer behavior, retailing, advertising management, marketing research, product and brand management, and experiential research methods. The topic she is delivering today is dialectic relation between policy and research in food marketing. I would like to take this opportunity to invite you also to the next inspirational lecture, which will be delivered on 16th of January 2025 by Dr. Jonathan Gorst from Sheffield Hallam University. And his topic will be reducing the carbon footprint of retail returns. Of course, you will get the invitation for this lecture separately. Now I want to wish you a good time with Dr. Sharma, and after lecture you will be invited to ask her questions on chat. So, Yukti, you are more than welcome to start your lecture. Enjoy. Good night.
Thank you so much, Professor Krishna, for inviting me and having me here. And I'm very glad to share my thoughts. So let me start with sharing my screen with all. So I hope my screen is visible to everybody. And so let me start with this session, and it actually relates to a dialectical relationship between policy and food marketing scholarship. My idea here is actually to build on one of the segment of the research paper, which actually got published last year, and particularly focus more on how a food marketing scholarship can inform as well as make corrective implementation for the policymakers. So let me start, and this actually happens to be a very overview of my presentation, but given the paucity of time, I'll make sure that I'll actually touch upon the topic in a succinct manner, but at the same time, make sure that things are quite at all understandable. So let me start with introducing this particular topic and what actually led to this particular research here. When I started doing this, taking up this particular study, it actually started and it built upon one paradox. And that paradox, what we call as to be an American obesity paradox, but it's intrigue enough to see that, there was increase in obesity alongside there is a simultaneous increase in the healthier food options, and also the policy intervention which encourages healthier food option. But the question is why these two things were actually increasing together. There was some knowing versus doing paradox which was quite visible. And of course, it actually led the commercial marketing fraternity, the de facto stewardship of enabling the informed food choices under scrutiny. And it actually led us much interest in the scholarship to find some workable solution to address this particular paradox. Now, in the very pursuit of finding a workable solution towards the American obesity paradox, it actually led to a lot of thematic complexities. And this has led to a nuanced F&B marketing discourse. So, in order to build and even dissect or deconstruct the dialectical relationship, first we need to delineate the thematic scholarship and the thematic complexities. Now, the question arises, if I need to delineate the thematic scholarship or the thematic discourse, why not to resort on the existingly held scholarship and existingly held synthesis effort? The answer to this is that all the effort and the synthesis effort, if we see and look at the past, pertains to food, health and nutrition, maybe to business research and psychology, and they adopt a very piecemeal approach. They focus specifically on one aspect of F&B marketing or maybe a specific target segment, maybe adolescent or maybe children for that matter. But we wanted some comprehensive synthesis in order to see how the thematic structure is formed of F&B discourse. So we actually saw that, there is one very interesting comprehensive synthesis, which was done by Silshanko and Oskega 2020. But they have adopted what we call as to be the healthism discourse or healthism lens. Now, healthism lens is a very powerful rhetoric when it comes to the food and beverage marketing. But the healthism discourse, it actually adopts this assumption of responsible consumer. It's a neoliberal logic which actually says that the consumer are responsible enough to make ideal choices, but it's not always the case. Consumer may form the choices not on the basis of the ideal or by knowing everything or maybe informed decision, but they actually form the decision on the basis of alternative explanation which comes from their emotion, from social environmental cues, sensory cues, which actually comes under another ideology, an upcoming ideology. We call it as to be Epicureanism ideology. So we try through this research to actually combine both of it together. So before I'll actually get into further details, I would like to actually shed some light on some of the terminology which I'll be using. And if you have seen the trailer and if you have seen the trailer abstract, you might have actually come across terms like healthier instead of healthy, unhealthier instead of unhealthy. Now, this reason lies in the fact that, when we talk about the food and beverages, we actually tend to adopt a dichotomous scale. We sacrosanctly classify the product of food and beverage into either healthy or unhealthy category. And as a resultant of it, it is also visible in US FDA definition 2012, which suggests healthy food item as to be low on trans fat or saturated fat, and also limited level of cholesterol and sodium level. The benefit of the same may qualify a particular food item into unhealthy food category. Now, having said that, it's not always the case. Now, when we talk about the food items which we consider as to be healthy, if consumed in a higher quantity, it will be actually categorized as unhealthy consumption. And in fact, if we consume unhealthy or so-called unhealthy food item in a smaller quantity, it will be categorized as contributing to your well-being. So instead of having a dichotomous scale, we actually tend to follow the continuous scale as well, which instead of classifying healthy or unhealthy, classifies product as to be more healthier or maybe less healthier. Now, another very interesting terminology, which is actually prevalent when we talk about the food and beverage marketing, is actually the lens of healthism, which has already been synthesized, and we try to complement by Epicureanism approach. Now, when I talk about the healthism discourse, of course, there is a neoliberal logic. We consider consumers are responsible enough to form their own decisions and healthful food choices. But at the same time, we need to appreciate the presence of Epicureanism, which not only focus on what we eat, how much we eat is equally important. Here we form decision also on the basis of the imagery stimuli, such as visual, auditory, gustatory, as well as olfactory, and even the social environmental factor. This part of the literature is not synthesized, and we want representation from this part as well to make and look at the bigger picture. So we try to address both the healthism and Epicureanism approach, and this is a larger part of the research question we try to answer as a part of our entire research which was actually published. more or less, I'll actually see that, what exactly is a performance structure of the literature. We'll also focused upon the theoretical, thematic, and the topical structure of F&B marketing. We see that how these particular thematic structures are then interacting with the policy or the prevalent international regulatory environment to come up with the gaps, and see how the policy actually are informed by scholarship, and then it informs the practices. So this is actually the methodology we followed. First, we followed the suggestion of Ye et al. 2021 and also Selshanko and Askegar 2020. Now here we actually defined our search string, keeping in mind that we actually address both the dichotomous as well as a continuous spectrum of healthy, unhealthy food marketing. We also try to address the Epicureanism approach and healthism approach as well. So we defined our search string keeping in mind the latest research which published. We conducted the search string, which comprised of these search strings. And we were able to retrieve 9,000 record from Web of Science and Scopus. Now we tried to filter and narrow it down, and we actually filtered on the basis of first peer-reviewed journal. We actually also saw that the language is one of the filter, and we consider a comprehensive subject domain of study, including business and accounting management, social sciences, psychology, and health. Now, we were able to retrieve around 1,500 or so record, but in order to actually balance out retrieve with that of relevance, we further conducted a direct and indirect quality judgments. So, of course, for indirect quality judgment, we saw where the research was published. So, journal quality was one of the very important factor. And for that, in order to filter on the basis of journal quality, we actually followed Svensson 2006, which is actually a quite at all flexible measure. Now, further, in order to do the direct quality judgment, we came up with around 4 coding criterion, which me and my co-author, we actually did the coding on base of these specific filtering criteria, the exclusion criteria. And after that, we actually conducted intercoder reliability, and we found that our Krippendorf alpha was greater than a threshold of 0.8. We were able to retrieve 334 articles, to which we added 4 more, because we found that by snowballing, we were left with some of the article from Dialectics. Now, in order to process the data and answer our research questions, we came up with this particular processing procedure. For first RQ1, we actually conducted the performance analysis based upon the productivity and citation of each and every research constituent. For RQ2, we actually we did a coding based on the theoretical framework. And in order to define what's theory and what's not, we followed a Sutton and Storr understanding of 1995. We further, in order to answer our RQ3, we actually did a co-occurrence analysis and bibliographic coupling to delineate the thematic and topical structure. And then we interacted it with policy, and we actually mapped the policy structure for 2 decades in order to identify, that how the research and scholarship, the research and regulation is interacting with each other. Thereafter, we've identified the gap, which enabled us to further identify the implication for practices. Now, coming down to results, I'll actually focus more on the specific research question, which is actually the dialectical relationship. But just to see and give a taste of what the scholarship looks like, the scholarship for 2 decades of healthy, unhealthy food and beverage market, it looks like this. It's a trend analysis here. We can clearly see in this trend that it can be qualified and can be divided into specifically 4 different chronological subsections. One, actually, we have the slow growth, where in the slow growth period, we can actually find from 2000 to 2005. Now, there is increase in the scholarly interest post that till 2010, until we observe a high growth time period from 2011 to 2015. And then we can see a sustained growth. And in order to dissect the performance structure, we found, the research constituent here. We found the prominent author. Professor Scott Burton has been one of the prominent contributor. In the institutional structure, we found University of Arkansas contributing a lot toward the scholarship. In the productivity structure, we found that Appetite and BFJ contributing a lot to the scholarship. And we found influential countries including USA, UK, Netherlands, and Australia. Now, this certainly satisfies some of the prominent laws here. First is Bradford Law, because what we found was around 20 article or 20 research journals are actually contributing more than 80% of the scholarship. Not only that, if we found the influential countries, then around these 5 countries you can, or the 4 countries you can see is contributing around 81% of the scholarship, further supporting the presence of the Matthews Law. Now, in order to actually further delineate our theoretical frameworks to see what exactly is the mechanism through which consumers actually process the food choices, we found that not all the articles actually subscribe to a kind of a theoretical framework. Only about 66% actually we found are using theories. And even in those theoretical frame, what we found is a brute empiricism, that the relation with what we call as to be the theory was actually very superficial, and more or less the existing findings were used in order to propose a hypothesis. What we can clearly see is a formation and actually the prominence of the psychological theories here, and even the economic theories, in order to justify the mechanism that the actually scholars are using to explain how the consumer form healthy unhealthy food choices. Now, this happens to be one of the very interesting finding. We actually were able to identify around 11 thematic structures. So the entire healthy, unhealthy food and beverage market, we try to actually divide that on the basis of the thematic structure. We identified 11 thematic structure. Now, of course, these 348 article, we were actually placed a minimum citation criterion of 10 minimum citation. And this led to only 244 documents which satisfy this criteria. And if we look at the connectedness, then only 174 articles were found to be connected to each other, rendering around 11 research fronts. Now, herein what we can see particularly is these 11 research fronts or research cluster were then actually given some themes. And as we can see, these 11 themes actually relate to either of the prominent lens, either the Epicureanism lens or maybe the healthism lens. What we can see is there is a dominance in the terms of volume when we talk about the healthism ideology. And that's what has been synthesized by Silshanko and Askegard in the year 2020. Now, at the same time, there is an addressed area, that is Epicureanism and alternative explanation. What we can find is particularly this research front relates to either the environmental consciousness or maybe sensory cues or CSR, TV advertising and pricing, and atmospheric cues as contributing to an alternative explanation to the food choices. So now we need to, once we got all the thematic structure, we then interacted with the policy making, and then we map all the policies specifically in the international regulatory environment. Particularly herein we adopted what we call as to be the dialectic relationship between the scholarship and policy. And each and every terminal that you can see over here in the figure number 2, be it 2006, 2011 or 2016, marks a major shift in the policies here, international regulatory environment. So let me just break it down, each and every research front, and how this particular, the publication trajectory is mapped to each and every research front can be seen here. Let me start with the first time period, that is 2000 to 2005. Now, when I go back here in this time period, apparently there was no prominent functioning legislative. One very guiding functioning legislative was by US, that we call it as to be the US Nutritional Labeling and Educational Act. Now, this started in 1990, but still actually happened to be the predominantly major deciding factor when we come down to the scholarship. And in fact, when we see this is actually the genesis of FDA, because FDA was formed somewhere in 1994 to regulate the act. Now, but here in this time period, if we can see that there are very less prominent research front. Apparently, there are 4 recent fronts which were active during this particular time, more or less related to the healthism discourse. Here, there was in this time period, the orientation toward customer need and how the customer forms the decision was almost negligible. Now, then came the year 2006, and this marked actually one of the very important policy initiative, which was actually marked by European Food and Safety Authority. Now, in this particular period, what we can see is actually EFSA led to the mandatory scientific validation of whatever the marketer's claims are. Now, when we talk about this, it led to an upsurge in the research front number 7. Now, if we see and go back research front 7, it actually relates to the functional food. And when we talk about the functional food items, now we need to have mandatory scientific validation of particularly the functional claim. Particularly when I'm saying, if this is a food item, it can increase your, let's say, bone strength. Particularly, I need to have the validation. Before that, I cannot make any such prompt claims. Now, this is one facade of EFSA 2006, but at the same time, it also insisted upon the marketer to adhere to the nutrient profile. So whatever the nutrient claims were should actually adhere to the nutrient profile, and that led to increase and upsurge in research front number 3. Now, there is a categorical transformation from limited customer orientation to actually making customer as to be the protagonist and protecting the interest of the consumer and nudging toward more healthier food choices. Now, then came the year 2011. Now, in 2011, what we saw here, the European Union insisted upon more responsible marketing. And this was an era where there were actually more and more policy regulation, and that's why the scholarship also saw around 207% of the growth, and it is categorized as high growth period. Now, in this time period, what we can actually see that more and more focus was making the marketer more responsible. One was by making the mandatory nutritional labeling. And of course, we talk about nutritional labeling, then there was an upsurge, particularly in the research front number 1 by around 630%. And during this particular regulation, they also insisted on transparency of ingredient, particularly on the allergen should be transparently be disclosed. It was also insisting upon disclosure of the additive information. And when I talk about the ingredient and I talk about specifically the additive, I'm specifically making and insisting on the claim which are process claims. And that is why there is an upsurge in the research front number 4 and research front number 6, particularly relating to the organic food items, which is again a processing claim. Now, during this time, as I told you that this was actually the period when the international regulatory reforms were actually made. So there was 2013 US FDA. And here in this particular period, what we can see that US FDA introduced food labeling guide. Now, this guide insisting on the prominent display of the nutritional fact and also improving the wording of the claim. Now, when I say the prominent display, it actually ensured that the consumer are referring to the nutritional claim before making a purchase. And this was very important to see some of what we call as to be information backfire effect. Now, what we found that when the nutritional, in this scholarship, when it reflected or echo upon, we saw that when the consumer saw there is a nutritional fact information, even on the indulgent food, it actually backfired instead of helping the consumer to actually make a healthier food choices. But here, predominantly and overarching in this particular era, the more effect and more emphasis were made upon making an informed and healthier food choices. Then came 2016 to 2020. Herein, we focused upon the sustained growth of this scholarship. And this started with 2016 FDA regulation, which related to further formalizing the nutrition fact label. Now, in order to formalize the same, the emphasis were made upon the format and content. Now, specifically enough, for the format, there were specific regulation on the serving sizes. So it has been said that the serving sizes should actually reflect the actual serving sizes of the product rather than making it to a standard serving size. And also, they insisted upon the prominence of the calorie consumption and the calorie intake during the time. This apparently led to it was reflected or echoed in the research front number 10, which led to upsurge because of this particular change in the regulatory reform. Now, during that time, just a year before, not in this year, but in this era, but just a year before, in 2015, what we also can see is actually emergence of sustainable developmental goal. And sustainable developmental goal, consumer recognize the very environmental consequences of their consumption. And the spillover can be seen during this era when we saw that the research front number 2 relating to the green and sustainable consumption has seen a remarkable upsurge. And herein we focused more from making only the informed and healthier food choices to empowering as well as enlightening the consumers. So this happens to be dialectic relationship, specifically how the scholarship try to actually verify the policies and thereby look at the practices and thereby inform the policymakers in order to protect the interest of the consumers. Now, apparently, scholarship on this healthism discourse was prominent till 2016. What we can see, the all research fronts relating to the healthism discourse, there is a fallout after 2016 because there was a growing understanding that the consumer are not forming decision only on the basis of their cognitive abilities, but they also form the decision particularly on the other alternative explanation which comes under the ambit of Epicureanism. So over in here, we should not deny the fact that there is a decline in scholarship and more effort must be made in order to inform the policy, but there has to be more effort toward explaining the alternative aspect of the consumption. So specifically, when we look at the policy frame and all the international policy frames, there are lack of discourse and there are lack of the policy initiatives which relates or explain the Epicureanism discourse and something which can actually be done in order to curb the opportunistic intent of F&B marketers. So that remain to be unaddressed and need much initiative in the near future. And specifically, by this study, what we try to see is a triad of strategy or the policy making, the marketer, and scholarship. Now, scholarship plays a very important role here. It actually verifies the policies which has been formed. It also actually see and look at the some of the practices which may be opportunistic on the marketer's point of view. Now, for example, just below calories. Now, just below calories create a lot of macro level halos. And this can actually enable or can actually be verified through a scholarship and can inform the policymakers. So when I talk about the food regulatory environment, it is quite at all complex because of the consumer underlying intent to make macro level assumption about food items. We generally make the assumption organic equals to healthy or maybe natural equals to healthy. Now, this blatant assumption or the macro level assumption actually require a lot of effort when we talk about verifying it and informing the policymakers. Apparently enough, we couldn't find any policy which may relate to Epicureanism approach. So further efforts are required for Epicureanism. Now, this is something which also actually blatantly calls for actions even for the online grocery platforms, which remain as to be, as of now, completely bereft of any kind of policy initiatives. Of course, there are recent call by for example, US FDA in 2023, which call for more standardization of the information display at online grocery platform. But a lot more much needs to be done when it talks about this triad and interaction there. So that's all from my side, and I am open to the question. I hope I did well in the terms of time. Yes, we do have 2 questions. Yes. Okay, so one question relates to the Krippendorf alpha. Was Krippendorf alpha reliability scoring based on the criteria for selecting the paper or coding of the themes within the individual papers? So we actually coded on the basis of each and every individual paper. When we actually can see here, let me go back to the slide here. I think this, yeah, this was a slide where it talks about the Krippendorf alpha. So what we did is actually we found around 4 criteria which are very relevant to address a problem. Now, it should be from the marketing area. It should actually relate to healthy, unhealthy, or unhealthier or healthier food marketing. And it should actually relate to some kind of eating outcomes or aftermath. It should relate to consumer. And based on that, both of me and my co-author, we did each and every coding based on the dichotomy, whether it's actually satisfied or not. Now, after that, we conducted a Krippendorf alpha, we checked on that, and we found it to be satisfying the threshold. And this is done for each and every individual research article. I hope this answers your question. One more question goes like, have you followed an overall methodological textbook, paper, etc., in your own methodological approach in your paper? Yes, we followed like methodology, particularly bibliometric and scientometric analysis is what we have followed in order to actually conduct all the analysis. If we talk about specific techniques that we have used in order to come up with the themes, we have used bibliographic coupling here. And in order to delineate the topical structure, here we use co-occurrence analysis as well. I hope that answers your question. So any more question? I'm welcome to all the questions here. Please put that in the chat box and I'll be happy to answer. So I think these are the questions and I have answered. I was able to justify your answers. And thank you so much. So this is all from my side. And it's a pleasure discussing and actually talking about my research article. And I hope it was helpful and actually help you in looking at the food marketing as well as the scholarship as well as policy making and practicing, how it interact and how it actually shapes the entire scholarship and the policy frameworks. So that's all from my side. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me here. And I think we can stop here. Thanks a lot.